David, the man after God's own heart. But inside his palace, a silent war was tearing everything apart. Multiple wives, rival sons, blood spilled. The polygamy that was supposed to make his kingdom stronger became his curse. Brothers killing each other, wives plotting, a father torn in two. How did the greatest king of Israel let his home turn into a battlefield? The tragedy of polygamy in David's palace exposes shocking truths about power, love, and the devastating consequences of turning away from God's plan. Multiple wives, a divided king, a broken family. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and stick around till the end to understand this tragedy of polygamy that changed Israel forever. You'll never see David the same way again. Picture a palace where love turned into war, where brothers became deadly enemies, and every marriage was a ticking time bomb. This isn't some fictional drama. It's the heartbreaking reality of David's kingdom, the man after God's own heart. While the world celebrated his military victories and spiritual devotion, behind the palace walls, a silent tragedy was unfolding. Polygamy, seen as normal back then, was destroying his family and planting seeds of destruction that would take lives for generations. How could a king who knew God's heart so deeply let his home become a war zone? How did multiple wives, who were supposed to bring joy and a lasting dynasty, turn into sources of rivalry, betrayal, and death? Today, we're diving into the dark secrets of David's harem and uncovering how his marriage choices not only divided his heart, but shattered his family and shook the foundations of his kingdom. Get ready for a journey that'll reveal disturbing truths about power, love, and the devastating fallout of walking away from God's original plan.
When God created marriage in the Garden of Eden, his intention was clear. A man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they will become one flesh. Not wives, but wife. Singular, exclusive, indivisible. But as humanity drifted away from God's original plan, polygamy showed up, not as a blessing, but as a tool for political survival. In the ancient Middle East, every royal marriage was a peace treaty, every wife an ambassador from her homeland. David, even though he was a man after God's own heart, wasn't immune to the geopolitical pressures of his time. Scripture never paints polygamy as God's ideal, but as a concession to human circumstances. When we read about David's many marriages, there's no celebration, just a dark story of consequences. Every new wife brought not just a political alliance, but seeds of future conflict. God himself had warned about the dangers of kings multiplying wives, saying it would turn their hearts away. In his quest for political stability, David was unknowingly building a ticking time bomb in his own home. David's marriages were strategic: consolidate power, secure peace with neighboring nations, and strengthen his position as king. Each marriage meant a diplomatic win, a safer border, an enemy turned ally. But what looked like political wisdom to people turned out to be a spiritual and emotional trap. David's heart, made to love one woman completely, was now split between multiple loyalties, demands, and expectations. The unity God designed for marriage was replaced by a complicated web of shallow relationships and clashing interests. The irony is brutal. The man who wrote the most beautiful psalms about God's faithfulness was living a life of emotional unfaithfulness. David would learn in the hardest way possible that when we try to improve God's plan with our own wisdom, we don't reap blessings, we reap tragedy. His wives didn't become sources of strength, but of division. His children didn't unite as brothers, but tore each other apart as enemies. And the palace that was supposed to be a sanctuary of peace turned into a battlefield where love was killed by ambition. But how exactly did these marriage alliances turn into deadly traps? The answer starts with David's first wife, a young woman who paid the highest price for being a pawn in her father's political game.
Saul kept trying to kill David,
and Michal was torn between loyalty to her father and love for her husband. In a crucial moment, she chose David, helping him escape through a window and tricking her father's soldiers. That brave choice should have brought them closer, but instead, it marked the start of a painful separation. David ran for his life, and for years in exile, Michal stayed in Saul's palace, a forgotten wife, a living symbol of her father's political failure. Michal's tragedy got even worse when Saul, in a calculated act of cruelty, gave her to another man, Palti. For years, she lived in this forced second marriage, while David built a new life far from her, marrying other women. When David finally became king and demanded Michal back, she was ripped away from Palti, who followed her, crying, until he was forced to turn back. Michal returned not as a beloved wife, but as a political trophy, a symbol of David's legitimacy to Saul's throne. The love that once shone in her eyes had turned into bitterness and resentment. But if Michal represents love destroyed by politics, David's next wife shows us a totally different kind of relationship, one born out of mutual respect and shared wisdom. In the middle of all the chaos of political alliances and arranged marriages, a different story pops up: Abigail. Her meeting with David didn't happen in a palace or through some diplomatic deal, but during a crisis that revealed who they really were. Abigail was married to Nabal, a rich man but foolish man. His name literally means fool. When David and his men asked for supplies after protecting Nabal's flocks, Nabal's rude and ungrateful answer almost got his whole family killed. David, furious at the disrespect, set out with 400 men to wipe out Nabal and every man in his household. That's when Abigail stepped up and showed some serious wisdom. Without telling her husband, she quickly put together a generous offering of food and went out to meet David. Her approach was brilliant. She took responsibility for her husband's mistake, appealed to David's conscience, and reminded him of his destiny as the future king of Israel. "Don't let innocent bloodshed stain your conscience when the Lord makes you king," she said. Her words didn't just save her family, they stopped David from doing something he'd regret for the rest of his life. Abigail's wisdom blew David away. Here was a woman who wasn't just physically beautiful, she had incredible emotional and spiritual intelligence. She saw past David's anger and spoke to the man of God he truly was. When Nabal died 10 days later, apparently from the shock of realizing how close he'd come to death, David immediately sent a marriage proposal to Abigail. This time, it wasn't about politics or some impulsive passion, but a conscious choice based on mutual respect and admiration for character. Marrying Abigail gave a glimpse of what David's relationships could have been if he'd put character above political convenience. Abigail became more than a wife. She was a wise counselor and a voice of reason in tough times. Her positive influence on David's life was a total contrast to the manipulation and political games that marked so many of his other relationships. She proved that a wife could be a true partner, someone who strengthens and builds up her husband's character, not just someone who serves his political interests or physical desires. When God created marriage in the Garden of Eden, his intention was clear. A man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they will become one flesh. Not wives, but wife, singular, exclusive, indivisible. But as humanity drifted away from God's original plan, polygamy showed up, not as a blessing, but as a tool for political survival. In the ancient Middle East, every royal marriage was a peace treaty, every wife an ambassador from her homeland. David, even though he was a man after God's own heart, wasn't immune to the geopolitical pressures of his time. Scripture never paints polygamy as God's ideal, but as a concession to human circumstances. When we read about David's many marriages, there's no celebration, just a dark story of consequences. Every new wife brought not just a political alliance, but seeds of future conflict. God himself had warned about the dangers of kings multiplying wives, saying it would turn their hearts away.
In his quest for political stability, David was unknowingly building a ticking bomb in his own home. David's marriages were strategic: consolidate power, secure peace with neighboring nations, and strengthen his position as king. Each marriage meant a diplomatic win, a safer border, an enemy-turned ally. But what looked like political wisdom to people turned out to be a spiritual and emotional trap. David's heart, made to love one woman completely, was now split between multiple loyalties, demands, and expectations. The unity God designed for marriage was replaced by a complicated web of shallow relationships and clashing interests. The irony is brutal. The man who wrote the most beautiful psalms about God's faithfulness was living a life of emotional unfaithfulness. David would learn, in the hardest way possible, that when we try to improve God's plan with our own wisdom, we don't reap blessings, we reap tragedy. His wives didn't become sources of strength, but of division. His children didn't unite as brothers, but tore each other apart as enemies. And the palace that was supposed to be a sanctuary of peace turned into a battlefield where love was killed by ambition. But how exactly did these marriage alliances turn into deadly traps? The answer starts with David's first wife, a young woman who paid the highest price for being a pawn in her father's political game. Michal, daughter of King Saul, was David's first wife, and maybe the most tragic of them all. Her story is a heartbreaking picture of how real love can be destroyed by political manipulation. The Bible tells us that Michal loved David, a rare statement in Scripture where it's usually the men loving the women. This pure, sincere love of a young princess for the hero who killed Goliath should have been the start of a fairy tale. Instead, it became the first chapter of a tragedy that would set the tone for all of David's future relationships. Saul, eaten up by jealousy and fear of losing his throne, saw his daughter's love as a chance to destroy David. He offered Michal in marriage, but with a deadly price: 100 Philistine foreskins. Saul hoped David would die trying, but he underestimated David's courage and God's protection over the future king. When David came back with 200 foreskins, Saul had no choice but to keep his promise. What should have been a celebration of love turned into a bloody political transaction. Michal wasn't marrying the man she loved. She was being handed over as a war prize. David and Michal's marriage started under the cloud of betrayal and manipulation.
But if Abigail shows what marriage can be at its best, the next woman in David's life shows what happens when power totally corrupts a man's heart. The story of Bathsheba marks the darkest point in David's life and shows the complete corruption of royal power. This wasn't a political marriage or a choice based on character. It was a brutal abuse of power that started with lust and ended in murder. One afternoon, when David should have been out leading his army, he chose to stay in Jerusalem. From his rooftop, he saw a woman bathing, and instead of looking away like a decent man would, he gave in to his desire and sent his servants to bring her to him. What happened next wasn't a romance, it was a crime. Bathsheba had no choice. When the most powerful man in the country sends soldiers to get you, you can't say no. The power gap was massive. He was the anointed king. She was the wife of one of his soldiers. He commanded armies. She didn't even have her husband to protect her, since he was risking his life serving the kingdom. What David called desire, modern law would call rape, the abuse of authority to force sex. Bathsheba became a victim not just of David's lust, but of a system that offered women no protection from the whims of the powerful. When Bathsheba found out she was pregnant, things got even more desperate. David tried to cover up his sin by calling Uriah back from battle, hoping he'd sleep with his wife and think the baby was his. But Uriah, a man of incredible integrity, refused to enjoy the comforts of home while his fellow soldiers were sleeping in tents on the battlefield. His loyalty and honor made David's betrayal look even worse. Frustrated, David ordered Uriah to be put on the front lines of the most dangerous battle and then abandoned, making sure he'd be killed. The king who once faced Goliath with courage now cowardly murdered one of his most loyal men. God's judgment was immediate and harsh. The prophet Nathan confronted David with a parable that exposed just how awful his actions were. A rich man stealing and killing a poor man's only sheep. When David got angry about the injustice, Nathan said, "You are that man." The consequences were severe. The child born from the affair would die, and violence would never leave David's house. This wasn't just adultery. It was the moment when royal power completely corrupted the heart of a man who once chased after God. Bathsheba, once a victim, became a wife, but her presence in the palace would always remind David of the sin that started a wave of family tragedies. But Bathsheba wasn't the only woman to suffer in David's polygamous system. There were others, even more invisible and vulnerable, the concubines, whose voices history has silenced. In the ancient polygamous system of Israel, concubines held a particularly cruel position. Not quite wives, not quite servants, but something in between. They were the king's property, living symbols of his power and wealth, but without the rights or protection that official wives had. David's concubines lived in social limbo, their lives completely at the mercy of royal whims and political shifts. Some were mothers to his children, but their kids rarely had any rights to succession. These women shared the king's bed, but never his heart or his important decisions. Their existence was a public display of David's virility and power, but personally, they were invisible.
The tragedy of the concubines became clear during Absalom's rebellion. When the rebellious son took Jerusalem, one of his first moves was a calculated act of political humiliation. He set up a tent on the palace roof and publicly violated his father's concubines in front of all Israel. This wasn't about passion, it was a brutal political statement. In the ancient Middle East, taking the previous king's women was a way to claim the throne for yourself. Absalom wasn't just shaming his father, he was symbolically taking over his kingdom by violating his women. The concubines became victims of a political war they never chose and couldn't escape. When David reclaimed Jerusalem after Absalom's death, the concubines faced an even crueler fate. They had been publicly violated through no fault of their own. Still, David could no longer be with them. They were now tainted by the rebellious son. The solution was lifelong isolation. They were placed in a separate house, supported like widows, but living as prisoners. They spent the rest of their lives in seclusion, neither wives nor free, paying the price for crimes they never committed. Their punishment was eternal loneliness, a living reminder of Absalom's rebellion and the shattered royal family. The story of the concubines reveals the dehumanization built into the polygamous system. They weren't seen as people with their own desires, dreams, or rights, but as political and sexual objects. Their voices were silenced by history, their names rarely mentioned, their pain ignored. They represent all the women who were sacrificed on the altar of male power, whose lives were reduced to status symbols and tools of political warfare. In David's palace, they were living proof that when power corrupts, it's always the most vulnerable who pay the highest price. Their wasted lives in isolation were the silent cost of unchecked royal ambition. But the consequences of David's polygamy didn't stop with his wives and concubines. The real tragedy was just beginning, showing up in the next generation as a deadly sibling rivalry that would turn the palace into a battlefield. David's polygamy didn't just shatter his heart, it planted seeds of destruction that would bloom in the next generation with unimaginable violence. His sons, born to different mothers,
didn't grow up as united brothers. They were rivals, locked in a deadly competition for their father's love and the royal succession. Each son carried not only David's DNA, but also the ambitions, resentments, and loyalties of their own mothers. The palace turned into a battlefield where half-brothers tore each other apart, fulfilling the prophecy that violence would never leave David's house. The first and most shocking sign of this inherited curse was the rape of Tamar by her half-brother Amnon. Amnon, David's firstborn with Ahinoam, developed a twisted obsession with his half-sister Tamar, David's daughter with Maacah. What he called love was really predatory lust that ate away at him until he was sick. Following the wicked advice of his cousin Jonadab, Amnon pretended to be ill and asked for Tamar to come take care of him. When she arrived, innocent and trusting, he brutally raped her. The act was doubly horrific, not just a sexual assault, but also the destruction of a virgin princess's purity, ruining her chances for marriage and a future. After satisfying his lust, Amnon immediately felt disgusted by Tamar, throwing her out in a cruel, humiliating way, leaving her devastated and disgraced. David's response to his daughter's rape showed just how much polygamy had wrecked his ability to do justice.
Even though he was furious, he didn't punish Amnon. Maybe because Amnon was his firstborn and presumed heir, or because punishing his own son would mean publicly admitting his failure as a father. This lack of justice fueled Absalom's resentment, Tamar's full brother, who saw the injustice as a personal betrayal. For 2 years, Absalom nursed his thirst for revenge in silence, carefully plotting Amnon's destruction. His patience and coldness revealed a calculating side he'd inherited from his father, but now twisted for destructive ends. Absalom's revenge was just as brutal as the original crime. During a sheep-shearing feast, he got Amnon drunk and ordered his servants to kill him. David's firstborn died not as a warrior in battle, but like an animal in a slaughterhouse, paying with blood for the blood he'd spilled. With this murder, Absalom not only avenged his sister, but also removed the main obstacle to his own claim to the throne. The royal family was now divided not just by rivalry, but by murder. The palace that should have been a sanctuary of peace became a house of horrors, where sons killed sons and a powerless father watched his family line fall apart. But Amnon's murder was just the opening act of an even bigger tragedy. Absalom wasn't satisfied with revenge. He wanted the throne, and he was willing to destroy his family completely to get it. While all the bloody tragedies grabbed the public's attention, a more subtle but just as destructive war was always brewing inside the palace walls, the rivalry between David's wives. Each of these women wasn't just a wife, but an ambassador for her own family's and nation's interests, a mother desperate to secure her children's future, and a competitor in a deadly game where only one son could inherit the throne. David's harem wasn't some romantic haven. It was a political battlefield where every smile hid a dagger and every kindness masked a strategy. The wives lived in constant tension, knowing the king's favor was limited and that one woman's fall meant another's rise. The logistics needed to manage this complicated family setup were wild and eye-opening. The palace had to have separate quarters for each wife and her kids, elaborate protocols to decide who got access to the king and when, and a strict hierarchy for public events. Each wife had her own servants, her own alliances inside the palace, and her own information networks to keep tabs on her rivals. The king had to walk a tightrope between these factions, knowing that showing too much favor to one wife could spark a conspiracy among the others. It was a system that demanded constant vigilance and internal diplomacy, turning home life into an extension of international politics. Bathsheba stood out as the most skilled of these political players. After entering the harem under traumatic circumstances, she quickly learned that survival wasn't just about beauty or sexual favor, but about political smarts. When David grew old and the question of succession became urgent, Bathsheba made a strategic alliance with the prophet Nathan and the priest Zadok. Together, they pulled off a masterful political move. Just as Adonijah, another of David's sons, was declaring himself king, they reminded David of a promise, maybe even made up, that Solomon would be his successor. The old king's weakness and confusion were used to make sure Solomon was crowned king before Adonijah could lock down his power. Bathsheba's win in the succession war wasn't luck. It was the result of years of careful planning and strategic alliances.
She understood that in a polygamous system, the smartest mom, not necessarily the most loved, would decide the dynasty's future. Her successful maneuvering of David in his final days secured not just her son's survival, but her own position as queen mother to the new king. The other wives, who'd spent decades fighting for attention and favor, realized the real battle had been fought in the halls of power, not the royal bedrooms. The harem had produced not just sons, but a whole new generation of ruthless politicians. But all this competition and scheming created an impossible dilemma for David. How could he be a fair father when his role as king demanded political favoritism? The answer to that question would reveal the fundamental contradiction that tore his family apart. David's final tragedy was realizing that polygamy had created an impossible contradiction in his life. He couldn't be a fair father and an effective king at the same time. Every parental decision had political consequences, and every royal action deeply affected his family relationships. When Amnon raped Tamar, David faced a devastating dilemma. As king, he was supposed to enforce the law that demanded the rapist's death. As a father, that meant executing his own firstborn son and presumed heir. His inaction wasn't just parental weakness, it was political paralysis. He couldn't deliver justice because his royal authority was compromised by his fractured family ties. Polygamy had made it impossible to separate the personal from the political. This paralysis happened again when Absalom murdered Amnon. Once more, David was torn between his conflicting roles. As king, he should have punished the murderer. As a father, he was secretly relieved that justice had been served, even if it was through illegal means. His response was to exile Absalom, not full forgiveness, not proper punishment, just a half measure that only halfway satisfied both roles. For 3 years, Absalom stayed in exile, a time that only deepened his resentment and gave him space to plot his revenge. David tried to be merciful as a father and just as a king, but ended up failing at both. The eventual reconciliation between David and Absalom was just as messy. When Absalom finally returned to Jerusalem, David at first refused to see him, keeping him in a kind of social limbo. This partial rejection only fueled Absalom's bitterness, who saw his father's coldness as public humiliation. When they finally met, the so-called reconciliation kiss was more of a political ritual than a real family reunion. Absalom had learned that his father's love was conditional and politically motivated, a lesson that only hardened him further against David. Polygamy had created so many children competing for attention that fatherly love became a scarce resource, handed out based on political calculations as much as on emotion. The end result was that David failed as both a father and a king. His sons grew up without clear moral guidance, seeing that the rules were different for the royal family and that justice depended on politics. They learned that power mattered more than integrity, that manipulation worked better than honesty, and that family was just another arena for political competition. When Absalom finally rebelled against his father, it wasn't just a political revolt. It was the cry of a son who had never received unconditional love or consistent moral direction. Polygamy had turned fatherhood into a political exercise, and David discovered too late that a man can't serve two masters. Either he's a father to his children or a king to his subjects, but he can't be both effectively when his family is a political institution.
And so we reach the devastating climax of this tragedy, Absalom's rebellion. where all the seeds planted by polygamy finally sprouted into a civil war that nearly destroyed the kingdom and broke David's heart for good. The story of polygamy in David's palace isn't just a historical account. It's a mirror reflecting the lasting consequences of turning away from God's original plan. Every extra wife David took might have seemed like a political win at the time, but in the long run, it turned out to be a spiritual and family disaster. The man who took down giants on the battlefield was defeated by the chaos in his own home. His many wives, who were supposed to bring him joy and secure his dynasty, ended up sowing seeds of rivalry, betrayal, and death. The palace that should have echoed with the laughter of children playing together was filled instead with the sounds of brothers at war. David learned, in the hardest way possible, that when we multiply our intimate relationships, we don't multiply our love. We divide it, we shatter it, and in the end, we destroy it. Today, while our society celebrates sexual freedom and questions the relevance of traditional marriage, David's tragedy stands as a prophetic warning. God's plan for marriage, one man, one woman, one lifetime, isn't some outdated rule, but a wise protection against the devastation we see in David's house. If you're listening to me right now, take a look at your own life. Where have you let the world's wisdom replace God's wisdom? Where have you chased after multiple sources of satisfaction instead of finding wholeness in God's design? David's story shows us that even the giants of faith can fall when they trade eternal principles for temporary convenience. Let his tragedy be our lesson, and let his pain wake us up to the beauty and safety of God's original plan for our lives and relationships. David's tragedy teaches us that even the giants of faith can stumble when they walk away from God's principles. If this story touched your heart and opened your eyes to the importance of following God's original plan, hit that like button and drop a comment saying, "I trust God for restoration," because no matter how broken your life might be, the same God who forgave David can totally restore your family and your relationships. Your declaration of faith in the comments might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If you're hungry for more biblical insights that'll transform the way you see Scripture, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you never miss a thing. We've got plenty more powerful stories coming your way, stories that'll strengthen your faith and open your heart to God's eternal truths. Every video is a journey of discovery that can change your spiritual life forever. And since we're talking about epic battles and divine victories, you've got to check out our next video, Lucifer was defeated, Michal secured Moses' body with unmatched power, an incredible revelation about an invisible war that happened in the heavens over the body of Israel's greatest prophet. Click the card on your screen now or find the link in the description. Get ready to uncover heavenly secrets that'll set your faith on fire and show you the unstoppable power of God's army. Don't miss this extraordinary revelation.